Hello everyone and welcome to another video on the Toliss Airbus A321, and today we're going to look at just the takeoff. I've had a few requests for a video on taking off the Airbus, so that's what we'll do today. We're here in Munich, Echo Delta Delta Mike, and as you can see, runway 26 right today. This won't be about all the other procedures, the taxi out and so on. This is simply about the takeoff technique. I've flied the Airbus in real life. I've got a few thousand hours on it, so hopefully this can bring another perspective to your home simulation. But as always, this isn't for any real-world use or for any actual Airbus flying technique. This is just for us on our home simulator. There are some differences which I'll talk about, which obviously we can't really get around at home. But overall, I'm very impressed with this add-on. So let's get started. So we're here in the flight deck, pretty much ready to go. I've got all the lights on and so on, as if we've done taxied out, ready to go, but we haven't got the performance done yet. Obviously we wouldn't do this in real life, but this is just so I can talk through it with you. So if we go to our Toliss plugin, we've already set up the MCDU and the FMGC. I've got a little flight plan Munich to Gatwick, I believe, yeah, with an alternative London Stansted. And if you need any help with this, I've provided the link to my video on setting up the FMGC for our flight. But we're at the last part of our setup, so we're at the performance part of this trip. So let's go to our loading performance. Today we've got a 0 fuel of 65,901. I'm going to click apply just to make sure the airplane actually has that in. And we've got a fuel, I'm just going to make that about 7 tons. There we go, quick refuel, defuel, so make sure you click on both of those. And now those figures are in. Normally we'd do that on the initb page, but you can't access the initb page with engines running, which we have already got here, so I can just check it on the fuel prediction page. 72.9 weight, which is about right. 66 tons plus about 7 tons of fuel to 73 tons. So a reasonable weight 321, not too heavy, not too light. So on our performance page, this is a great piece of software by Toliss. I really like it. I'm just going to select flap 1 for our takeoff performance. This is a long runway. In real life, there's all sorts of ways that we calculate which flap we're going to use. The more flap you have will mean you need a shorter time or a less distance on the runway, but it also means once you get into the air, you have a slightly lower climb gradient. There's all sorts of details about takeoff performance, so I don't want to spend too long talking about that today. If you want to hear more about it, let me know, but there's lots of information out there on the internet on takeoff performance numbers as well. But as a basic then, so long runway, we're going to go for flap 1 plus F. Flight plan is active because in my flight plan A, I've got the Munich 26 right, radar 6 November departure, I believe it is. So, use toga thrust. If it was a short runway, we could select to use toga thrusts. Rare in real life, any normal performance day you wouldn't use toga. If you have snow or something like that on the ground, a contaminated runway where the performance could be worse than on a normal nice day like this, obviously it's dry and sunny here, then you might use toga as well. Airlines have their own procedures for when they want to use toga thrust. So for now then, we can check for a 26 right at Munich and V1. Sorry, I'll start with the flaps actually. We've got flaps 1 plus F, so I'll put 1 in here. On the ground in the Airbus, if you select 1, it will always give you 1 plus F, which I can show you now. If we look down here, oh, can't see it there. And I'm going to select flap 1, and you see it automatically goes to 1 plus F because we're on the ground, so the flaps come out as well. Flex temp 37. So this means we're not using full takeoff thrust. The higher that temperature, the less thrust we're using, and it goes down. There is a minimum temperature you can use before it's just a toga takeoff. So we're going 37, so slightly reduced thrust today for takeoff. And we'll do the speeds. Speeds 160, 160, 162. I don't want to talk about it too much, as I said, but the V1 speed, below V1, so below 160 knots, we can reject the takeoff and stop on the runway because there's still space. Above V1, you can no longer reject the takeoff because there isn't enough runway. VR, 160 knots, that's when we're going to start rotating the airplane for takeoff, so lifting the nose off the runway. V2 is our minimum climb away speed, so we'll make sure we climb away at or above V2, even on one engine. It has all sorts of parameters and controllability and climb gradients to make sure we clear the terrain and keep climbing, that sort of thing. Great, so that's just a very quick rundown of those numbers. Transition altitude, that's when we convert to a flight level. So today It's 5,000 feet. This doesn't tend to change. This will be a local airport procedure thing. Thrust reduction acceleration altitude is where we lower the nose and go from our takeoff climb into our en route climb, and it starts accelerating the airplane, and that's the point soon after which we'll start retracting the flaps. That's the acceleration altitude, 2980. The thrust reduction altitude here is when we will bring the thrust back. So in some airports, they'll ask you to keep climbing as best as you can, but you can reduce the thrust earlier, and then you'll climb, and then you'll lower the nose and accelerate with a slightly reduced thrust later on. So for today, we'll just keep those as standard. As you can see, Munich, it's quite a high airport, 1,500 feet up. So that's for 1,500 feet and 1,500 feet above the ground. So that's quite standard. We're cleared up to flight level 70, but for now, I'm going to keep it on the QNH until we are up and accelerating. Different airlines will have their own procedures on that. So that's a quick rundown of the performance page in there. Again, do let me know if you have any more questions on it, or if you'd like to see more detail on it. So now we're going to talk you through what we're going to actually do on the takeoff. So in the Airbus, if we're stopped like this, then we will spool up the engines a little bit, so to about 50% N1. We'll put in half side stick forward, and I'll show you on the PFD. This little cross shows you what you're doing with the side stick. So I'll have about half forward. That way, as we add the thrust, we keep the weight on the nose wheel. It provides a little bit extra weight as we're accelerating down the runway, and that helps us steer at lower speeds. So we're going to put in our half side stick, set the 50% thrust. Then once the engines have stabilized, we can release the brakes. Would have been holding it on the toe brakes or the regular brakes, not to the parking brake. Once we release the brakes, we can then set the thrust into the flex gate, which is here, flex MCT, because we're doing a flex takeoff. If it's toga, we would go all the way through to toga. And then we'll start rolling down the runway with the correct thrust. As we go through 80 to 100 knots, we'll release the pressure on the side stick to neutral. And then once we reach our V1 and rotate speed of 160 knots today, then we'll start our rotation. 3 degrees a second, usually up towards maybe 15 degrees, but these are quite high speeds, so we'll see what the aircraft asks for once we get into the air. We'll also start the timer before we do any of this. In the real airplane, pilot monitoring would start the timer, which you'll see appear here, because with 2 engines, we can only run takeoff thrust for 5 minutes. We can't leave it at takeoff thrust for too long. So we have that limitation there to keep track of. So that's why we'll do that. Okay, so let's go. We'll do a takeoff, and then I'll talk through some of what we're seeing as we go, as well as I'll do another replay of it so you can see the more details. So I'm going to start by releasing the parking brake and holding it on the toe. So I'm holding the brakes. There we go. Parking brake's released. I'm going to start the timer. We're going to imagine that we will clear for takeoff, and you check with the other pilots. Obviously done all our checklists and so on. Half side stick forward and bring the thrust levers up towards 50%. I'll have the PFD up here. So 50%. Stabilize. Release the brakes. Oh, not sure why I've done that. And then 2 clicks forward. And we get man flex 37, SRS runway, water thrust blue. So now we're looking out towards the end of the runway, just keeping it straight using the rudder. We don't use any of the nose wheel steering tiller, we just use the rudder. There's our 80 knots. Release the side stick to neutral towards 100 knots. And rotates. Positive climb, gear up. It's going to nav. It's quite hard to get the right rotation on the home simulator, but you're aiming for about 3 degrees a second. And now we're climbing in our SRS mode and nav mode. We have the option to engage the autopilot already, but for today I won't do that. Here we go then, lever climb as I said, and it wants us to, it's changed from SRS to climb. So lower the nose towards climb and bring the thrust levers back to climb. thrust, climb, climb, and the auto thrust is now engaged. And now I'll put in the autopilot so I can talk to you. Autopilot 1. So now the airplane is starting to accelerate. We have this speed limit 220 knots. That's because of the departure SID has that limit. I can see it's at this point, the Mike November Echo. Once we are above S speed, that's when I can retract the flaps. They're currently out at 1%. So there's the S speed, retract the flaps. Our green dot is just about the same as that speed limit. If that speed limit was below our green dot, we would probably leave the flaps out. And now it's accelerated to 250 because we're past that speed limit point, and the next point is 250 knots. Once the flaps are retracted, I can disarm the spoilers. We don't need the ground spoilers anymore. And I'll probably turn off these nose wheel lights because they're no use to us. Now we're climbing up to a flight level, so I'm going to set standard. And there we go. Flight level 70. And you can see now I can stop the timer. It's been 3 minutes and we weren't even at the takeoff thrust for 3 minutes. So on a normal takeoff it's quite rare to reach that. 5 minutes would be very rare. In fact, you shouldn't ever reach it. And here we are, climbing away.
So here we are, another takeoff clip, just so you can see some of those details again. So putting the side stick to half forwards, spooling up the engines. There you can see our elevator move down. Stabilising the power and releasing the brakes. Off we go. We're using flex temperature takeoffs. We could simply set toga and that would be fine. We have the toga option available to us at this point. I'll show you later what that looks like if we set it once we're in the air. But if we were suspecting there was some sort of reason to use it, maybe a slight wind change, or we didn't set the thrust levers properly in the first place, something like that, you can just go to toga. Same again, looking out to the end of the runway as we accelerate along. And here's our rotation. And now you see it's in SRS. So what is SRS? It stands for Speed Reference System. And on 2 engines, it means it's going to fly at V2 plus 10. So our V2 speed was 162 knots. So you can see here it's targeting 172 knots. In the real aeroplane, I would expect that magenta bug to stay at 162, but the airplane will actually target 172. If we lost an engine at some point on takeoff, that would then target V2, so 162 knots. And that's our vertical profile. That's what the flight directors are guiding us towards. That speed with the thrust. Here we go then. It changes to climb mode. Now we're out of the takeoff phase and we bring the thrust back. You'll see the S speed, that's when we're going to retract the flaps, so that green S. If we were taking off flap 2 or flap 3, we'd see a green F before that S. And it doesn't matter if we took off in flap 2 or flap 3, once we pass the green F, we would retract to flap 1. So from flap 2 or flap 3 takeoff, we would go to flap 1 when we're above the green F. And then we would be in this situation and wait until we're above the green S before we retract the flaps to 0. So here's the green S and the flaps go to 0. I haven't got a flap 2 or 3 takeoff recorded because the speeds weren't quite working out performance wise, so I'm hoping to get that done in the future. And here we go now, accelerating up to 250 knots as in our previous takeoff. It's worth noting that these takeoffs we're looking at today are all with a light headwind. If there is a tailwind or a crosswind over 20 knots, then there is a slightly different technique that we would use, which I will do in another video. It's surprising how much there is to talk about even on the normal takeoffs. There's still a few more bits to come in this video. So that'll be a separate video if you guys would like it. Depending on the engine, that crosswind limit can also change, different wind speeds, and it's mainly to do with making sure the engines spool up at the same rate, and you keep the lateral control of the aircraft in a crosswind or tailwind. But here we go, these are all, as I said, with a light headwind. So what we're going to see next in this clip is the auto flap retraction. So we're just going to cut ahead slightly, so here we are already in the climb, and we'll see another outside shot here. So first of all, if you see on the engine display that magenta TO inhibit, takeoff inhibit, that's because the Airbus knows it's in the takeoff phase, so it's inhibiting certain cautions that aren't important to us now. So if something fails now, depending on what it is, the airplane may not tell us if it doesn't think it's important. So here we go into climb mode and lever climb as we've done earlier, thrust climb, climb. So what we'll see now is the flaps auto retraction. So with 1 plus F we have some slats out and some flaps out, that's the F part. As we go above 210 knots, the flaps will automatically retract, and what that does is they have a lower speed limit than the slats. So once they auto retract, you'll see that red overspeed bar move higher up the speed tape. Those speed limits are slightly different depending on the airplane and which fit you've got, but you'll see the auto retraction as we pass through 210 knots. So here I'm not touching the flaps, I'm leaving them exactly where they are. As we go through 210, you'll see that 1 plus F, and there you go, the flaps are starting to retract. And now our red bar has increased up to 240 knots on this airplane. As I said, that does vary depending on the airplane you're in. So I just thought that would be a useful thing to show you. And now we can retract the flaps as we would normally. So we go from 1 to 0, and it just brings in those slats and we clean up. And off we go again.
Okay, so for this takeoff I want to do something slightly different. I'll show you a rolling takeoff. This is something air traffic might expect us to do if there were aeroplanes on approach, and it's certainly quite common in day-to-day life if you were at a holding point and then you're cleared to line up and take off all in one go. Sometimes air traffic do that, sometimes they clear you to line up and then you have to wait and then you take off, in which case we would use the technique we saw earlier. So this time let's pretend that we're cleared to line up and take off all in one go. Something else I'd like to show you is I mentioned the thrust reduction acceleration altitude. So what I'm going to do is increase the acceleration altitude only. So we'll reduce the thrust at the same point, which is about 1,500 feet above the airport, but we're going to accelerate 3,000 feet above the airport, so 4,480. But to do it, I just have to put in the slash first, so it goes into the second half here, so slash 4,480, and that goes in there. This would be common if an airport asks you to do a specific noise abatement procedure. So this way we'll keep climbing at that same angle for longer because the airplane won't lower the nose until 4,480 feet instead of 2,980 feet. That way we're higher up above the ground quicker, but we've also reduced the thrust earlier. So we're on a lower thrust, steeper angle, and then we accelerate higher. Okay. Right, so I'll pretend we've been cleared to line up and take off from air traffic, put all the lights on. We'd obviously check on TCAS, check on the approach. And let's go to take off. So a couple of differences here. It's not to be rushed, it's still got to be the safest thing, so it's only if you're well prepared for it and ready to go. All we do is we set the thrust while still moving. So we set to 50%, let it stabilize, and then continue to the flex takeoff thrust, all without coming to a stop. So very similar to what we did earlier. You don't want to set that thrust until you're pointing down the runway, so I'm not even going to bring it to 50% N1 to stabilize until I'm happy that we're pointing in roughly the right direction. Otherwise you could find yourself in difficulty trying to control the airplane onto the center line. So as I said before, pilot monitoring would set the timer as you set the thrust, but I can just do it here. Bring ourselves onto the center line. And now I'm going to bring the engines up towards 50% N1 and put in that forward side stick. And we're going to say take off. There's 50% and through to our flex gate. And flex 37, SRS runway order thrust blue. Brings me on to a good point. We can always go to toga. So the toga is an option for us at any point in the takeoff up until we've already started to accelerate. So I can just go to toga now and we see man toga, and then that increases the climb gradient. As you see, we pitch up more. Great, so there we go. Now it wants to leave a climb, so I bring it back.
From toga is 2 clicks.
Thrust climb, auto thrust, and you'll see that we have stayed in SRS, so we've still got that good rate of climb. As we pass through our 4,500 feet roughly, this will change to climb mode now. There it is. And now the airplane lowers the nose and we'll see it start to accelerate. And then it's just as it was before.
Thank you very much for watching. That's the end of this video on the takeoff. As I said earlier, this was just normal light headwind or no headwind takeoffs with flap 1 in the Airbus. Hopefully it gave you some more context on your home simulations. Please do let me know if there's anything else you'd like to see about these. As I said, I'm planning to do some more on the different types of crosswind or flap takeoffs. Again, this is not for any real world use, just for our home entertainment with our home flight simulators. Thank you for watching, and see you again soon in another video on the Airbus.